When a B-17 Flying Fortress returned to base with its entire tail section missing, engineers declared it aerodynamically impossible. Yet there it sat on the runway, a machine that had no right to fly, let alone land. This is the story of a bomber that defied physics, a pilot who refused to give up, and a crew that lived through what should have been their final moments. April 25, 1944. The skies over Nazi-occupied France. The 306th Bomb Group, stationed at RAF Thilly in England, had just completed another devastating raid on German industrial targets. But one aircraft, a B-17G named All-American, was about to face a trial that would rewrite the rules of what was considered possible in aviation. First Lieutenant Robert Harper had logged 43 combat missions. At 24 years old, he commanded a crew of 9 men aboard their Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress, serial number 42 to 31,333. The B-17 was legendary, designed to absorb punishment that would obliterate lesser aircraft. Its four Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines could keep it airborne even with two knocked out. Its armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks had saved countless lives. But the engineers at Boeing had never anticipated what was about to happen. The mission that morning was straightforward. Join a formation of 247 heavy bombers striking the Messerschmitt assembly plants at Regensburg. German fighter production had to be crippled if the Allies were to maintain air superiority for the coming invasion of France. Harper's crew knew the risks. The Luftwaffe was bleeding, but cornered enemies fight hardest. And Regensburg was deep, so deep that fighter escorts would have to turn back long before the bombers reached their target. The formation had crossed into German airspace at 0847 hours, climbing to 27,000 feet. At this altitude, the temperature outside was 45 degrees below zero. Inside the aircraft, crewmen wore electrically heated suits that often malfunctioned, leaving men with frostbitten fingers struggling to operate their weapons. But cold was the least of their concerns. By 1100 hours, the fighter escorts waggled their wings in farewell and peeled away, their fuel gauges demanding they return to England. The bombers continued alone into the heart of the Reich. That's when the Luftwaffe struck. Hauptmann Franz Stigler's JG-27 had scrambled from their base near Stuttgart. Flying Messerschmitt Bf-109G, 6 fighters, they climbed toward the American formation with murderous intent. Stigler himself had 97 confirmed kills. He knew exactly where to aim: the cockpit, the engines, the fuel tanks. He had lost too many friends to these American bombers to show mercy. The first wave hit the formation at 1,114 hours. Tracers streaked through the sky like deadly fireworks. Harper's ball turret gunner, Sergeant Michael Romano, watched a B-17 300 yards to starboard explode into a fireball that consumed all 9 men instantly. No parachutes emerged from the inferno. The bomber simply ceased to exist, transformed into falling debris and black smoke. Fighters, 11 o'clock high. The call came from the top turret gunner, Staff Sergeant David Chun. The Messerschmitts dove through the formation in pairs, their 20mm cannons hammering. The noise was apocalyptic. The roar of engines, the stuttering of machine guns, the shriek of shells passing inches from the fuselage. Harper held formation. Breaking away meant certain death. The only safety was in the massed firepower of the group. For 38 brutal minutes, the attacks continued. The B-17s pressed on, their defensive fire claiming 6 German fighters. But the Americans were losing aircraft too. Harper counted 11 bombers falling from the sky, trailing smoke and fire. Some broke apart in midair. Others spiraled down, their controls shot away. A few crews managed to bail out, tumbling through space before their parachutes deployed. Most wouldn't survive German captivity. At 1,152 hours, the formation began its bomb run. Flak exploded around them in black puffs that could shred aluminum and flesh with equal efficiency. The 88mm guns below knew their altitude and speed. It was simply a matter of filling the sky with shrapnel and waiting for the laws of probability to take effect. Harper's bombardier, Lieutenant James Mitchell, hunched over his Norden bomb sight, calling corrections. Left, left, steady, steady. The bombs fell away at 1,157 hours, 500-pounders tumbling toward the Messerschmitt factories below. The formation banked hard, heading for home. But the Luftwaffe wasn't finished. Not even close. At 1,203 hours, Harper saw the Messerschmitt coming from 7 o'clock low. Stigler had circled back, determined to add one more kill to his tally. He selected Harper's B-17, not because it was damaged, but because he'd learned to trust his instincts about which bomber was vulnerable. Something about its position in the formation, perhaps. Or maybe just fate. Stigler opened fire at 800 yards. His first burst missed. Harper threw the B-17 into a desperate evasive maneuver. Not a turn, but a violent sideslip that seemed to hang the 30-ton aircraft in the sky like a grotesque puppet. Stigler adjusted, closed to 600 yards, and fired again. This time, his 20mm rounds found their mark. The shell struck the B-17's tail section with devastating precision. The first explosion severed the elevator control cables. The second blew away the entire horizontal stabilizer. The third detonated against the vertical stabilizer, shearing off everything behind the tail gunner's position. In less than 3 seconds, the B-17 had lost nearly its entire empennage. The effect was instantaneous. The bomber pitched violently forward, entering an uncontrolled dive. Harper hauled back on the yoke with every ounce of strength he possessed, but the controls were dead. The altimeter unwound with terrifying speed, 26,000 feet, 24,000, 22,000. The wind screamed through the shattered tail section. Sergeant Thomas O'Brien, the tail gunner, was gone, still strapped into his position, but no longer connected to the aircraft. He fell separately, his parachute blooming white against the blue sky. "We're going down." The navigator, Lieutenant Carl Johnson, shouted into the intercom. "Bail out. Bail out." But Harper wasn't finished. Something, stubbornness, training, or divine inspiration, made him stop fighting the aircraft and start thinking. The B-17 was nose-heavy, diving at terminal velocity toward the earth below. But it still had 4 working engines. And engines produced thrust. If he could get the nose up, even slightly, maybe he could use differential power to control the aircraft. He pushed all 4 throttles to maximum power. The Wright Cyclone engines roared, their propellers clawing at the thin air. At 18,000 feet, still diving, he pulled back the throttles on the bottom 2 engines while keeping the top 2 at full power. The asymmetric thrust tried to rotate the bomber. The nose came up 1 degree, then 2. The dive angle decreased from vertical to 70 degrees. Still deadly, but no longer quite so hopeless. "She's responding." Harper screamed into the intercom. "Stay with the aircraft. Do not bail out." At 12,000 feet, the B-17 was still descending, but no longer diving. Harper had coaxed it into a controlled descent by using nothing but engine power and small adjustments to the wing flaps. It was flying. If such a word could describe the ungainly, shuddering progress of a bomber with no tail. Every aeronautical engineer who had designed the B-17 would have sworn it was impossible. The mathematics didn't support it. Wind tunnel tests would have predicted instant catastrophic failure. But Harper was flying it anyway. The immediate crisis had passed, but Harper faced a new problem: how to get this crippled machine across 300 miles of enemy territory and the English Channel. The B-17 was barely controllable. Any sudden movement caused it to pitch wildly. The slightest turbulence threatened to send them spiraling into the ground. And they were alone. The formation had continued without them, disappearing into the distance. Harper established a heading of 270 degrees, due west toward England. He maintained altitude at 10,000 feet, which kept them out of the worst of the German flak, but meant a 4-hour flight home instead of the usual 90 minutes. Fuel was going to be desperately tight. The B-17 carried 2,780 gallons in its Tokyo tanks, but combat maneuvering and maximum power settings had consumed fuel at an alarming rate. The flight engineer, Technical Sergeant William Hughes, calculated they had maybe 3 hours and 40 minutes of fuel remaining. Maybe. At 1,340 hours, they crossed the French coast. The crew could see the Atlantic breakers below, white foam on gray water. England lay 115 miles ahead across the channel. Harper didn't dare descend. Without a tail, landing would be nearly impossible even under optimal conditions. But the weather was deteriorating. Cloud layers at 3,000 feet, visibility dropping, and fuel gauges trembling toward empty. The co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Frank Morrison handled the radio, broadcasting their emergency on all frequencies. Any station, this is B-17 Fortress 1333 declaring emergency. We have severe structural damage and request priority landing at nearest suitable field. Our position is 15 miles south of Dover, heading 270, altitude 10,000. RAF Fighter Command picked up the transmission. Within minutes, 2 Supermarine Spitfires climbed to intercept, not as enemies, but as escorts. The British pilots pulled alongside and gaped at what they saw. One radioed back to his controller. "This fortress has no bloody tail. I repeat, the entire tail section is missing. How in God's name is it still flying?" There was no answer to that question. It simply was. At 1,447 hours, the English coast appeared through broken clouds. Harper had nursed the bomber across the channel through sheer force of will, making constant tiny adjustments with the throttles to keep the nose level. His arms burned with fatigue. Sweat soaked his flight suit despite the freezing temperature. But they were over England. "Philly Tower, this is Harper. We're coming home, but we can't land normally. I need the longest runway you have, every fire truck you can find, and a lot of prayer." The tower controller's voice was steady, professional. "Roger, Harper. Runway 27 is cleared for emergency landing. Wind is 280 at 12 knots. Fire equipment is standing by. You're cleared to make your approach at your discretion." Harper began his descent at 1,501 hours, reducing power millimeter by millimeter. The B-17 wanted to pitch nose down with every reduction in thrust. He compensated by adjusting the trim tabs, tiny surfaces on the wings that were never designed to control pitch. It was like performing surgery with a sledgehammer, but somehow it worked. At 500 feet, the runway filled his windscreen. Fire trucks lined the taxiway, their crews standing ready. An ambulance waited, its back doors open. The entire base had turned out to watch what everyone assumed would be a fatal crash. 200 feet. 100. Harper cut power to the bottom engines, held maximum power on the top engines for just 2 more seconds, then chopped all throttles simultaneously. The B-17 dropped like a stone for the final 20 feet, slamming onto the runway with a bone-jarring impact that collapsed the tail wheel, or would have, if there had been a tail wheel left to collapse. Metal shrieked against concrete. Sparks showered from the ruined tail section, dragging on the pavement. The bomber skidded and bounced, but Harper stood on the brakes, and miraculously, wonderfully, impossibly, it stopped. 3,800 feet down the runway, the B-17 shuddered to a halt. Harper shut down all systems with trembling hands. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then the radio crackled. "Harper, that was the finest piece of flying I've ever witnessed. Welcome home." The crew evacuated through the waist gun positions. All 8 surviving men were uninjured except for frostbite and exhaustion. When the ground crew arrived to assess the damage, they found that the entire empennage had been severed just forward of the tail gunner's position. The aircraft had flown and landed with literally no tail surfaces at all. Photographs were taken from every angle. Boeing engineers were summoned from the United States to study the wreckage. Their conclusion was unanimous. This should have been impossible. First Lieutenant Robert Harper was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions that day. His citation read, in part, "For extraordinary achievement while serving as pilot of a B-17 aircraft on a combat mission over enemy-occupied Europe. When his aircraft sustained catastrophic structural damage that rendered it unflyable by all conventional standards, Lieutenant Harper displayed exceptional skill, courage, and determination in maintaining control and returning his crew safely to base." The bomber itself, serial number 42 to 31,333, never flew again. But it served one final purpose, proving that the impossible was merely the improbable. Engineers studied the wreck for months, learning valuable lessons about aircraft stability and control that would influence designs for decades to come. 8 men survived because one pilot refused to accept the impossible. Sergeant Thomas O'Brien, the tail gunner, was captured by German forces and spent the remainder of the war as a POW. He was liberated in April 1945 and returned home to his family in Pennsylvania. The rest of Harper's crew completed their tour of duty and returned to civilian life. Bound forever by the memory of the day they flew a B B-17 with no tail. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.